Hi y'all, my name is Mr. Chao and welcome to Chao Time. I'm back with another new brand to the channel. This is the Marathon GSAR, which is the government issued search and rescue. That's what that stands for. I think it's pretty interesting that this is a watch that has been out in the field. Not this particular watch, but this series of watches has been out in the field serving those who serve the military. And not just the United States military, but militaries all over the world. In order to review the watches that I have to sell the watches that are currently in my collection. So if you'd like to take a look at the watches that I have for sale, you can take a look at my Instagram. It's in the description below. And if you can't, that's okay. You can still like and subscribe. That would also help to support the channel. The way I review watches is by taking a rubric and applying that to the watches in a variety of categories. That gives me a total score. I then take that total score and I apply a value multiplier to it to get a value score. I then rank those two scores, the total and the value, against all the other watches that I've reviewed to get a ranking. And at the very end, I give a completely subjective, personal biased opinion on the watch, basically letting you know my thoughts and my purchasing decision way of thinking about things. After the review, I give a completely subjective opinion on the watch based on my own biases and considerations, and it basically gives you some insight into how I choose to buy watches. Before we get into the review though, I first like to take a look at the purpose and design philosophy behind the watch. And this really is a no frills, all function tool watch that just is built to a specification to be useful and leaves everything else behind. So let's get to it. Let's start with the function, feel, and visual appeal of the case and bracelet. The stainless steel watch pretty much has one single finish, and that's a straight brush. The only exception is the clasp, which has one tiny bit of polish. Of course, when in the field, soldiers probably don't want a watch that is highly reflective, so it makes sense in the context of the purpose and function. Speaking of the bracelet, we can start there this time. It has the only branding visible when the watch is on the wrist, just the simple text embossing of the brand name. The clasp has some friction components, which is not my favorite. As I've stated many times before, I've had watches where these friction pieces have worn out or bent out of shape. However, this clasp does snap shut with an authoritative click. It has plenty of micro adjust holes and a diver's extension, great for the overall functionality of the bracelet. Functionality will be the theme of this case and bracelet, if you haven't already guessed. Links are held together with screws, which is awesome to see, and of course the end links are solid, as expected at this price point. Unfortunately, the links only articulate at one end, so the comfort is slightly affected. Coming back to the case shape, it's a fairly classic design with some tweaks to make it more functional. For example, the bezel is thick and gear-shaped, making it very easy to turn. The clicks are satisfying and turns with just the right amount of force. The crown is also extra long and well-sized to be used with slippery wet fingers, or even with gloves. This is probably one of the most functional crowns I have ever experienced. Just look at that amazing texture. Screwing the crown in affords the watch 300 meters of water resistance, a feature that I find most necessary for everyday wear watches. The crystal is completely flat and causes no distortion at all. There is a tiny bevel on it, which matches the case angles and shape well. It also has an uncolored anti-reflective coating, again increasing its functionality. Just outside of this is the bezel insert, which is made of some sort of metal. I could not find the material. It is engraved with minute markers and some numerals, and serves as a countdown timer. There is a bit of loom on the triangle at 12 o'clock, which is nice. What would have been super nice is if the numerals were loomed as well. The case has spring bar holes to make strap changes easier. In fact, every surface seems to have been designed for the end user in mind, with no frills or gimmicks. Just a well-made, functional tool watch. 7 out of 10 for form, 8.5 out of 10 for function. Let's move on to that matte black dial. The dial has never cast a reflection since I've had it. It's always legible, if a bit busy. There is a lot of information packed into the dial. Military time, the H3 radioactive markers, water resistance rating, the automatic movement, the brand name, tritium hour markers, a minute track, and finally, a date window squeezed in. Most of this, with the exception of the tritium tubes, is painted on. The quality of the print is very high. In fact, I was surprised when I looked at it through a loupe. The tritium tubes glow green with the exception of the orange 12 o'clock tube, which helps to orient the watch dial when in complete darkness. The tubes have a half-life of between 10 and 15 years, which means that in that amount of time, the tubes will glow half as bright. After about 25 years, the watch will only be about a quarter as bright as it was when brand new. This watch was supposedly purchased in 2017, although I'm not the first owner and I don't have a receipt. But that places it at 4 years, which means it's still pretty fresh. It's still plenty bright and emits enough light to slightly illuminate my hand when holding it close to the watch face in the dark. The tubes also stand off the dial enough to make legibility even better, and helps to add some interest to an otherwise plain looking dial. It's great when functionality improves form. The hands continue the design cues from the dial. Matte white paint that does not reflect light and increases legibility. Tritium tubes set into the hands to help the user see the time. The tritium tubes are extremely functional, as they do not need to be charged to glow. This is great if you're in a dark environment for more than 20 hours or so, when typical phosphorus loom would stop working. The tip of the second hand has a tiny bit of red, which, along with the water resistance rating, are the only design choices that seem to be made for aesthetics. I appreciate this tiny bit of color, as it doesn't detract from the functionality at all, but does give the watch a bit of character. Overall, the dial is another exercise in function over form. 8.5 out of 10 for form, 10 out of 10 for function. Let's move on to the SW200 within the watch. The Solita movement is a clone of the ubiquitous ETA 2824. I cannot see the movement to see what level of movement it is, or how highly decorated it is, so I just rated it at the lowest level. It has a 38-hour power reserve, ticks at 28,800 beats per hour, hacks, hand winds, and has a date complication. These movements are generally adequately finished. It's easy and cheap to service, and has a solid history of reliability and robustness. An excellent movement to put into a watch such as this. There are some advantages to having an automatic in a military professional setting. 1, they are not susceptible to EMPs, and 2, there is no chance that the battery dies while out in the field. 5 points out of 10 for form, 6 out of 10 for function. That brings the score so far to 40.5, so let's move on to the most objective category, the brand heritage and prestige. Marathon was founded in 1904 and rebranded in 1939 under the Marathon brand we now know. They are one of a few companies that has a deep military connection. They have made watches for the Canadian military, Israeli Defense Force, Taiwanese Navy, as well as the United States Department of Defense. As such, these are mil-spec. Because of their focus on military specifications, the company does not really have a long list of technological innovations. However, because of their robust and no-nonsense build, and naturally their military connection, Marathon has developed a small but dedicated following with those looking for an EDC tool watch. Especially in the US, there's a group of consumers who enjoy buying mil-spec equipment, and this watch fits the bill and looks good sitting right next to the other mil-spec items. However, there are also enthusiasts who believe that the watch offers little in terms of value, especially those who rate movements very high in their purchasing decisions. Add to that the plain aesthetics and lack of brand panache, and many watch enthusiasts just don't have a reason to love the brand. For the mixed opinions, Marathon earns a 6 out of 10 for brand heritage and prestige, bringing the total score to 46.5. The GSAR seems to be in production, although the website is out of stock as of the making of this video. They can be found from $600 to $1,100 USD, depending on if it's on a bracelet, and can be found at various online retailers. You can find them for $900 on bracelet if you are patient, which is the price I will use, and brings the value multiplier to 1.427, and the value score to 66.3555. In total score, it tied the Casio G-Shock Titanium Square, but I used the retail price as a tiebreaker, placing it in 12th place. In the value category, it comes in 8th place. Well-deserved, Marathon. So, that brings me to my personal opinion on the watch. I traded the Jeanneau Ocean Rover for this, and I'm pretty happy that I did. It's not the best looking watch, and it is really chunky and top heavy and not really very comfortable compared to the Jeanneau. And there are some kind of parts that seem out of place. Well, basically just the clasp. It's stamped and a little bit cheap feeling for something at this price point. But those negatives are, I feel, far outweighed by the positives. First, the touch points are amazing. The crown is the best I've ever felt, and I love using it. And I wish that more crowns were a little bit easier to use. The bezel is also really easy to use, and it ratchets really nicely. So I really enjoy that. It's not quite the best bezel I've ever used, but it's definitely still up there. Also, I'm starting to appreciate this minimalistic look with just the numerals and this, I don't know, military-esque dial. It reminds me of the Hamilton khaki field, which I also like, but I've never owned one, and I feel like this is a nice entry into that style watch. I really like the tritium tubes. I like that when I wake up at 5 a.m. they are still bright, and I have no problem at all reading the watch. In fact, it's much brighter at 5 a.m. than any of my other watches. I really like having a watch that is completely brushed. Most of my watches have some sort of polish on it, and I usually don't mind unless the watch is overly polished, but just having something that is completely brushed, I think I like it. It's super tooly, and I like this aesthetic. And I wouldn't mind if more watches had less polish on them. And it helps make it a nice everyday watch for me. The only thing is that it is pretty chunky and top heavy, and that does not make it a great everyday watch. But outside of that, I have been wearing this every day for about 2 weeks now, I think, and I really like it. actually haven't even thought about putting any other watches on, just because this is such a easy grab and go. I know that it's super tough. I don't really think about scratching it or banging it up against anything. It's one of those watches that it just really adds character to, and yeah, I'm just not really worried about it. I think that this radioactive sign is sweet looking. I just think it adds a little bit of flair to an otherwise pretty plain looking watch. One thing that is weird about it is that the dial is really recessed into the watch because the bezel is so thick, and the dial looks really small. So even though it's a big wearing watch for 41 millimeters, it looks small when you're looking at it. And I guess those two things kind of balance each other out, or it's an odd pairing, to be sure. At the end of the day, it's a Swiss watch that has, in my opinion, a lot more charm than it has negatives, and is probably my favorite watch that I've purchased since my last State of the Collection. And speaking of which, is it going to stay in my collection? I honestly think it is. There's nothing else that I've gotten over the last 6 months that really compares to this in terms of desirability for me. It's different in my collection. There's nothing really like it, and I like that, and it also fills some desires that I have that a lot of the other watches don't. So only time can tell, but right now it's looking really good. So that brings me to the end of the review. Is there anything that you would change about the rubric or the scoring? Let me know in the comments below. Also, if there's anything that you'd like to see me review, you can let me know that as well. Thanks for making it to the end. I appreciate you. Bye, y'all.